Hi everyone, today I'm presenting our paper titled Mum and Dad, Help Me Keep My Mother Tongue, an unheard voice from Vietnamese-Australian children. This research is part of the VietSpeech project funded by an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant awarded to Professor Sharynne McLeod and Dr. Sarah Verdon. As you know, children often grow up with the same voice as their parents, and this supports family cohesion and personal development. However, children growing up in immigrant families do not always have this asset. Many immigrant children do not speak the same mother tongue as their parents due to unsuccessful transmission of home language between generations. You may know there are so many benefits of multilingualism, including better career opportunities and economic outcomes, greater social adaptation, greater appreciation and understanding of different cultures, a stronger sense of identity and ability to form relationships with family and community members who may only speak the home language, and better executive brain function. The Vietnamese community in Australia. Vietnamese is now among the top 4 languages spoken in Australia, and the Vietnamese diaspora is currently experiencing the second and the third generation. Research shows the risk of language loss in the third generation, so obviously it is now a critical period to maintain home language. This research is informed by Spolsky's language policy theory. In Spolsky's conceptualization, language policy for a speech community includes 3 components: language practices, language ideologies, and language management. Language practices are related to which languages are used, while language ideologies or language beliefs or attitudes refer to the degree of support for the use of a language. Language management refers to the explicit policies and plans at work to influence the language practices and ideologies of the community. At the family level, in a multilingual context, language practices are affected by the language proficiency level of family members and the desire to use or not to use a language in a certain situation. The desire to use or not to use a language is influenced by the attitudes and beliefs that family members hold towards a language. And language management involves family policies and rules of which language to be used in the family domain. So here are some results from our previous studies. We identified parental factors associated with children's Vietnamese proficiency and use. These include the parents' income, Vietnamese proficiency, length of stay in English-speaking country, Vietnamese language use with children and in social situations, perceptions of importance of home language maintenance, and the parents' perceptions of cultural identity, and the presence of home language policy, the presence of language policies. Now, the aims of this study. So the main aim of this study is to explore family language policies of Vietnamese-Australian families. Specifically, we wanted to answer the 2 questions. What factors are linked with having a family language policy? And what family language policies do families have? So in order to find out the answers to those questions, we had 151 Vietnamese-Australian parents completed our questionnaires, online and paper questionnaires about their family language policies and related factors. So here are some demographic information of the participants. Excuse me. In terms of data analysis, so we have two types of data. The quantitative data, so we did the bivariate analysis, persons correlation and ANOVA test, and then the multiple regression model to identify or to find out the factors that are associated with having family language policy. For our qualitative data, we did the content analysis using NVivo to find out the details about the family language policy. Here are the results. So the first question, do you have a family language policy? So in answering this question, we had 35.6% of the participants said yes to this question. That means around a third of the participants had family language policy. And among those who had family language policy, only we had 72%, excuse me, 72.5% said yes to the questions. Do you consistently enforce your family language policy? I mean, 2/3 of the families who had family language policies did consistently enforce their family language policy. Excuse me. We also identified significant parents' factors associated with having a family language policy. These include the parents' Vietnamese proficiency, the parents' Vietnamese language use with their children, and their intention of future residence in Vietnam. With the NVivo analysis, we found out the 4 common language policies. These are the use of Vietnamese with the nuclear family, the use of Vietnamese outside the nuclear family, the use of English outside the home, and the use of English at home. Excuse me. In terms of the first family language policy, the use of Vietnamese with the nuclear family, so the families wanted the children to use Vietnamese within their nuclear family in circumstances like at home, with the parents, between siblings, and at mealtimes. For the use of Vietnamese outside the nuclear family, the families indicated that they want their kids to use Vietnamese with family friends, with relatives, at Vietnamese language schools, and at cultural events. Some families prefer to use English outside the home, or many families wanted their children to use English outside the home. These are the situations where they go out with parents or the children are at school, or the families are at mixed gatherings, or the children are with other children when in Vietnam, so they can speak English. For those families who indicated they use English, or their children can use English at home, these are the families with one parent speaks Vietnamese and one parent speaks English, or the children can speak either Vietnamese or English with their brothers or sisters. And also they can speak English only at home when father is at home. So from the results, we would like to discuss a few points here. So first, parents wish to maintain home language for their children, but this is not always reflected in their language use or the presence of consistently enforced family language policies. Number 2, the presence of a family language policy was associated with higher Vietnamese proficiency in use. So for families who are not so good at Vietnamese, so they don't seem to have a family language policy. And having a family language policy was significantly related to Vietnamese-Australian parents' intention of future residence in Vietnam. So, so this is a case when the families want their children to maintain Vietnamese and have a consistent language policy because they want to go back to Vietnam in the future. So this is, so this put a question of, so how about those who would not go back to Vietnam? So there's, so what's the motivation then? Number 4, the low number of families having a language policy suggests the need to raise awareness of its importance for home language maintenance. So with the findings and the discussion, we concluded that 1, having a family language policy is significantly associated with the success of home language maintenance. And 2, the absence of a family language policy in 2/3 of these 150 Vietnamese-Australian families points to the lack of voice in the home language of these children. And 3, an explicit family language policy aimed at maintaining Vietnamese at home will help Vietnamese-Australian children speak the same languages as their parents, promoting multilingualism and supporting their speech and language development. With this research, we have some implications. So the implication for children, kids around the world are speaking lots of languages. So you can speak both English and Vietnamese. You can play games, sing songs, read books, and talk to people in both English and Vietnamese. So ask your mom and dad to help you speak Vietnamese. The implication for families, having a consistent family language policy, that means a set of rules around how languages will be used in a family, makes it easier for your family to maintain your home language. If you want to maintain your home language, work together to develop a set of rules to support the use of your home language with your children. And lastly, the implication for practitioners. Home language maintenance has many benefits and does not negatively impact upon children's development. We can advise multilingual parents to have an explicit family language policy to promote the use of home language among family members. That comes to the end of the presentation. So if you would like to have more information about our research, so feel free to contact us with our email or on Twitter. Thank you very much for your attention.